Hello, very beautiful community. Trump has attacked the England manager, Thomas Tuchel, and we're going to assess whether Trump is talking out of his bum. And then we'll give a bit of cultural and historical context to the World Cup final, because it's a very important cultural event. But before, let's do a little bit of a political roundup. I want to touch on two things. Ukraine bombing the Russian Amazon, wild breeze, and these political perturbations in Ukrainian domestic politics, which I approached at a kind of fairly abstract psychological level when I talked about them last. I'll just point out a couple of quick political trends to help ground us on that. It'll be just 2 minutes. First, there is a pattern of centralization of power. There's a centralization of presidential power that we're seeing, and a degree of emaciation of Ukrainian parliamentary democracy. This is something that's going to have to be renormalized post-war. The second thing we're seeing is a kind of thing I gestured at in the last chat when I said that the perception of Zelensky's legitimacy as being all about his indispensability to the sustenance of Ukraine's future is going down relative to where it was a few years ago. But let me say something more concrete now. Historically concrete, at least. We are seeing something like the pattern that we witnessed with Churchill or maybe with Gorbachev, where a figure is thrust forward by historical circumstances into a genuinely heroic performance. But then as circumstances change, new answers are required to new questions from new people, and the status of that person's remarkable achievements remain, but their relevance to the future changes. And so you're seeing that if you, for instance, look at the demographic that is enormously keen on Mr. Fedorov, folks who understand the centrality of the kind of innovative ideas he has to Ukraine's future. And a lot of that demographic has got a negative trend of support for Zelensky, right? His support is dropping among that demographic. That would be very fond of Mr. Fedorov, and Zelensky realizes that's a problem. Now, quickly on Wild Breeze. I won't say anything about the ethics of war and hitting civilians and proportionality, because I've done a couple of threads on that, and I'll dump one of them in the next day or two on Substack and link it up in the community post so you can see it. I'm not a big fan of the over-ethicization, blah, 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 however you say that, of war, especially defensive war, where values like survival, sustainability take priority over justice, proportionality, blah, 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 right? But politically, the cover that the Ukrainian government is giving, that Wild Breeze platforms the sale of military uniforms, some components can be used in the war, that's really very secondary indeed. It's largely a cover. The purpose of the attack is economic and political / psychological, to trigger the Russian population into some kind of activity, which is not a particularly successful enterprise, because what Ukraine taking the war to Russian soil and hitting Russian civilians does is place a kind of additional explosive device beneath a scenario of transformation that would have to be triggered for other reasons. That explosive device is not self-triggering. So you're kind of loading up the social fabric to be more explosive when change occurs, which attacks of that kind in Russia are not going to cause in of themselves. Something else would have to cause that change. So it's economic and political psychologic intent. World Cup. Trump criticized the England coach, Thomas Tuchel, and Trump said something like, I don't know anything about sport, but nobody knows more than me. And it looked like Harry Kane was very far back. He was defending very far back, and nobody knows less than me, but also more than me. And so he basically said, with that kind of language that England's best players was stuck at the back and Harry Kane was stuck at the back. And I played golf with him and he was stuck at the back. He was defending, but he's an attacker. And nobody knows less about coaching than me. So what do I know? But I'm also very good at this sort of stuff. So is Trump right? Is Trump right for the wrong reasons? And then let's ground ourselves about the essence of the World Cup final culturally after dealing with England's defeat, because it's interesting. Now, I'm not a big fan of saying people are right if they're right for the wrong reasons, right? I'm not impressed by the thought that John Mearsheimer predicted Russia's attack on Ukraine, because to explain what happened, you have to explain it for national security, for regime security reasons, not national security reasons. So if you give a national security explanation of Russia's war, of the kind that Mearsheimer is given, of the kind that Peter Zion gives, and you say you predicted it, you didn't predict it, because you need to have friction with the causal process, basically. I don't predict something if I say it happens for one kind of reason and it happens for another kind of reason. And our culture is full of the elevation of people who predict stuff for the wrong reason. And algorithms really promote that, because it's very easy to say A said that X would happen, X happened, so A is now going to be on all the platforms talking about his opinions and her opinions. But now let's look at this, because it's possibly a case of somebody very brilliant at their job making a very big mistake and then being unable to admit it to themselves. Now, football is hard. I don't know anything about football. I'm an amateur, but I know enough to know how little I know. As a teenager, I wanted to be a football manager, so I stood on football pitches in the middle of the night for hours. I made notes. I did a little bit of coaching. Essentially none, but tiny bit. So I have an understanding of what I don't understand. If we take an average football supporter and put them on the touchline, even though they've been to a lot of football matches, and even though they have witnessed a lot of live football, they're really still going to struggle. They're going to see a sea of legs and they're going to be confused, especially when they have to make decisions under time constraints. So we have to understand that it's very difficult work that top-level managers are doing. This leads to the second point. You're working under unbelievable time constraints. You're working under unbelievable pressure of time, not because you've got 30 or 40 minutes left to do something, but because every 3 or 4 minutes, a new moment can arise on the pitch. And if you don't react to it in some way, and even the very act of reacting is very difficult. The way you react is a little bit like this, right? Because I can't stand, I've got this grabber. I've got many grabbers. This one is long. So it's like me trying to grab something with my grabber. It's going to be indirect. You have only very partial friction over what happens on the pitch from the touchline. And you're under these time constraints where you have to sort of live in these bubbles that last 90 seconds, 300 seconds, and morph in and out of one another and lead to other bubbles that you can only partly anticipate, and you need to start making decisions, and decisions that look to what might happen ahead under this kind of time pressure, which requires tremendous concentration, but also the kind of relaxation that allows you to break free from pressure and feel that in these 3 minutes you see the genesis of something that's going to materialize 9 minutes later, and you can do something about it. And then, of course, there's this extraordinary difficulty of the manipulation of space, right? And what we saw, and this is not the central failure, but it is a failure of the England team. What we saw is an inability of the England team in the last, 20 minutes of the match, in the last 10 minutes in the match, even more so, to take care of what was happening in that space that is the left fullback flank of the England team. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that the way space is generated on the pitch is a product of the obstruction or the generation of space elsewhere. So it's not like, oh, there is a bit of space here, let's take care of it. But it's rather there is a chain of sort of fleetingly occupied and deoccupied bits of space that all interpenetrate, that then can trigger a situation where there is a bit of an uncovered and empty zone that you're not taking care of, right? So that's very difficult, and the England team that's happened quite often actually at the highest level, had a failure of that kind. And a lot of victory at the highest level of football is the generation of failure at the level of this kind of causal mess of evacuation and occupation of space, leading to more evacuation and occupation of space, leading to then some kind of gap that is a matter of, if you like, inadequately attended to space. And so England had the personnel to take care of that gap, but they didn't do it. Now, to the critical part. My own personal view, I won't give you an analysis of why, is that Thomas Tuchel made as big a mistake as any I have seen made by a manager at this competition. The best justification for what he did is that the team was naturally falling into a defensive pattern. And what one might argue in his defense is that he simply said, if that's going to happen to us anyway, we might as well solidify ourselves in the vantage point into which we are retreating. Now, Tuchel's colleague Jurgen Klopp would not have made this decision. Tuchel is one of the best managers in the world. Klopp is probably ahead of him in the pecking order of German managers. Klopp is probably number one. There's a couple of other really great ones. And he wouldn't have made that decision, because he would have said, there's a natural tendency for us to retreat, but I am going to push us to do the opposite and thereby put stress on some of the weak points of the Argentinian team. An Argentinian team that had vulnerability in the full-back positions, that had centre-backs who were booked. And what ended up happening is that under extreme constraints of micro-decision after micro-decision needing to be made by the England manager, he basically avoided doing all the things that Argentina would have feared England doing most in that last half an hour. Now, I won't justify why I'm saying this. It will require a 2-hour football story. I'm not going to give you that. But what's absolutely fascinating here is that the manager wasn't able to admit this. In other words, he said that his own actions were not centrally causal to England's failure on the pitch, because he thought that there was a process that was happening anyway, and he reacted to it by trying to best manage it. The objection, which I won't justify in this case to the manager, is that there was a destructive pattern happening on the pitch, and he locked the team into an even more dramatic version of that destructive pattern. Why did the team begin to struggle so much and lose confidence? There are 101 football reasons, but I don't want to rave on about football to you, so let me give you an interesting cultural reason that is one of the top 5 reasons. Post-imperial lack of confidence. Do not underestimate how much confidence that individual players have is doubly derived. Derived from the football culture of that country, right? The confidence of the Argentinians was derived from the football culture of that country when they pressed England. But secondly, the confidence that you can scoop up from the football culture of your country, the football culture of your country can then scoop up from the general cultural predicament of your country. And part of the lack of confidence of England players is to do with a lack of stabilization of a post-imperial British confidence. This is something that, even though the German team was a calamity at this World Cup, this is something the Germans managed to solve really well in the post-war couple of decades. And that absolutely translated into capability on the football pitch for the German team. So this is not the central reason for confidence on the pitch, because as often football processes are caused by other football processes, and that's the explanation you need to give. You don't want to externalize things too much. Very often in life it's the case that art is explained by art, which is explained by art. Football is explained by football, which is explained by football. You don't want to externalize too much, but there is that space. And by the 60s, German football stabilized a confidence that was also manifested in Germany's historic success in penalty shootouts, for instance. That was a product of a sort of a very healthy hard look at itself that Germany took. It took a long time for that to happen, but it happened within a couple of decades. My country never arrived at a sense of post-imperial confidence, so we're kind of culturally stuck, and it's a very big part of British insecurity. Now, what happens when you, and I'm going to say something even more crazy to sort of whack you out, and you're going to think that's it, he's lost it completely, and that's going to be good. So what happens when you don't have the cultural confidence to lean on, and your football culture gives you both reasons for confidence and insecurity, is that there's a kind of reversion to something that has shades of neoliberalism to it, whereby each player, not out of self-obsession, but out of fear, withdraws into a bubble of protecting their career and protecting their brand. This is not screw everybody else mentality. This is, I love my brothers in my team. I want to work with them. Things are not working, so I'm just going to hang on and try to do my job as much as possible, and I just drop what it means to take responsibility for the whole team, because I don't have a way of holding that, even though I really want to hold that. So it's not a kind of yucky consumerist neoliberalism where people go self-indulgent. It's a situation where you default into self-preservation and brand protection, because it becomes bloody hard to hold a sense of the collective together, and holding it together becomes something that only the most psychologically astonishing players on the pitch can do, like Jude Bellingham. And that's because, right, you are on the pitch going through a situation where there is a dissolution of collective purpose. It's not just that the players don't have a clarity of vision about what they can realistically do together. It's also that there is a kind of this out of sync moment between you and the coaching team. Now, one of the problems with the critique of the England team that I made is that, unfortunately, even if I'm wrong, which I'm not, but even if I'm wrong, completely wrong, some of the players agree with me, not with the manager. And therefore, over the next few months, the team is going to have to bridge this, because Jude Bellingham thinks, I'm quite sure, that that was some weird shit from the manager. Harry Kane doesn't overthink it as much. He's not an overthinker at all. But he'd say, yeah, it was a bit weird. We did our best. I don't quite see that one. And yeah, I did have a big impact on my career because I might not play in the next World Cup. Jude will think about it more deeply. He will think that the opposite should have been done. And he'll understand why a coach took a certain line. He will understand that's not all on the manager, because the team was already retreating while the manager wanted it to advance. But then the manager consolidated, dramatized its retreat, and took away any sort of paddles or oars it had to, float its way out of that predicament. So that's a gap that's going to have to be bridged. Okay, enough on England. The final of the World Cup. Well, something beautiful about it beyond football is that there are some domains of life in which extreme elitism is totally benign. Art is one domain. I'd argue philosophy, certain kinds of intellectual pursuits are another, right? If somebody gets completely outclassed in that domain of art or philosophy, nobody's going to lose their healthcare. Nobody is going to have less money to buy groceries for their kids, and so on. So there's a kind of a benign dimension to extreme elitism, and it's relatively the same in sport. There's obviously a lot of unconstructive elitism, a lot of horrific consolidation of power and wealth that's unconstructive, but there's that healthy elitism there too, right? In virtue of Lionel Messi being far better than any player of his generation, nobody's going to lose their health benefits, basically, right? So something very beautiful about that, and it's a kind of elitism without cost. So it's the wonders of extreme human achievement without any losers being there as a result of something extraordinary being achieved by somebody else. Also, there's a kind of element of meritocracy. In other words, you can't bullshit your way into being the best player on the pitch. You either are or you aren't. Right? So it's that healthy, wonderful relation that for all of the commercial and loveliness of high-end sport you get, which is the sense of intensified demonstration of the wonders of human flourishment. Now some football context, beautiful community, for the final. Football is in a relative slum by historical standards. The best player in the world got knocked out in the semi-final, Kylian Mbappé. And Kylian Mbappé is a player who would be one of the top 10 best players in the world in 1990. He's the best player in the world today. So we're in a bit of a talent-wise lull. The second best player in the world will be on the pitch, and that's Lamine Yamal. Messi you can't rate, because Messi currently is a quarter of what he used to be. And that could be a little bit strange for people new to the sport, for US Americans watching this. Where is this greatest player of all time? Yes, he's doing really well, but is he really as great as he's said to be? And the answer is no. He's not even half as great as he was. It's rather that what he is doing is utterly astonishing relative to his age, and what he's doing is genuinely so effective that he is, even at 39, one of the very best players in the world, and the most influential member of their national team. The most influential member of any national team of the big teams, because the team is built around Messi, and so he decides much more of what happens for Argentina, even more than Mbappe does for France. When was the last time there was a really great team? 2008 till 2012, that was the Spanish team. If that Spanish team were in the final, it would be a matter of how, and maybe even by how many goals, they beat this Spanish team and this Argentinian team. Before that Spanish team in 08 and 12, to go back and find a team that is as great or greater, you'd probably have to go back to the early 70s for Brazil and mid 70s for the Netherlands. Johan Cruyff's Holland, and the Brazil with Pelé and all these other players who scored that extraordinary goal in the 1970 World Cup, where half of the team was involved, and then Pele pass to the right back Carlos Alberto to slot it into the low left-hand corner of the goal. So that's kind of where we are historically. Don't buy into the story this is Messi and Yamal one versus the other beyond a certain point, because Yamal will never reach anything like the level that Messi was at. Yamal will never be one of the greatest players of all time. That's not going to happen. So this is not two giant football greats coming together. This is probably the greatest player of all time. Who is now a quarter of what he used to be, playing against an amazing player in Yamal, who is probably one of the 100, could be one of the 100 best players of all time, could be one of the 50 best players of all time, possibly, depending on how his career evolves, could even be higher, but there's no prospect of him becoming as great as Messi or Maradona, or even Cristiano Ronaldo or Ronaldo Nazario, the number 9 Ronaldo. So enjoy it, beautiful community. I deliberately didn't mention all the authoritarian political stuff, Trump's involvement, because I wanted to say something light and positive and mostly football-centered. Okay, enough blubbering on from me. Catch you later, beautiful community. If you're going to watch it, enjoy the match.